Hi everyone, gonna do one last recording for the semester. We're just gonna go over the exam real fast. Because I didn't have time, unfortunately, to write any comments on anyone's exam, so I figured we'd just go over it collectively. So with that said, let's just begin going over things. So in an inductive generalization, a larger margin of error means that the conclusion is more likely to be true, but making a weaker claim. Right? The margin of error sort of has this sort of inverse relationship. You give yourself more wiggle room, so it's more likely that what you're saying is true, but you're also less precise as a result of that. So next, explain how inductive arguments differ from inductive arguments. In inductive arguments, the conclusion follows from the premises of probability. In deductive, the conclusion follows with necessity. And that's why both probative and statistical arguments are inductive. Both of them are probabilistically true conclusions. But they're not probabilistic in the same way. In the case of probative inductive arguments, the conclusion sort of is supported by, or you have reasons to believe the conclusion because of the premises. But those reasons are in principle defeatable. Whereas in statistical arguments, right, the premises tell you exactly how likely it is that the conclusion is true. But you could still get unlucky, right? You could go with something that has a 95% chance of being true and still just get unlucky, be in that unfortunate 5% chance. So that's why both are still inductive. Right. These reductio arguments, the key thing I was looking for was sort of properly identifying where they went wrong when they went wrong. So in this first case, I'm pretty sure that one day a marathoner will officially break the 2-hour mark in running a marathon. We're pretty close. But you can't really believe that human beings will definitely be able to run faster and faster marathon times. If that were true, then why not think that one day a person will run a marathon in 1 hour or 30 minutes or a minute or a second? All right. So if the person B is the one making the reductio, what are they saying here? They're saying person A's claim is absurd because it produces absurd consequences. That's sort of to summarize or paraphrase the argument. All right. So we do indeed point out something absurd. It would indeed be absurd if someone could run a marathon in 1 second. And I don't see any slippery slope fallacy here either. If people could indefinitely run faster and faster, then yeah, you would expect them in principle to always be able to run faster times. The problem is that this is a straw person fallacy. Person B is not saying and never says people will be able to run indefinitely faster and faster. That's just never said. And so therefore, perhaps absurd implications of that claim have been revealed, but those absurd implications don't at all refute what person A says. So bad reductio. In the case of number 2, on the other hand, I think we've got, on the whole, pretty good reductio. So this is the argument where the mom pulls out the classic, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? With slight and important variations. So, all right, is there something genuinely absurd? Yes, it would be absurd for a mother to let someone jump off a bridge. That would be indeed a absurd implication, right? If the child is correct. Do we have a slippery straw person fallacy? Many people said yes, but I don't really see why. I don't really see what the straw person fallacy would be in this case. The child has said, the reason you should let me go is because all of my friends are doing it, right? That's the reason. The mother says, why should I let you go? And that is the reason that the child gives. That's not a very good reason, but that is the child's reason. So that's not a misrepresentation. And it's also not a slippery slope then. No, if I should do whatever, or I should be allowed to do what all my friends are doing, and all my friends were allowed to jump off the bridge, then I should be allowed to jump off the bridge. In this case, the mother's not actually saying the child, if you go to this concert, you're going to end up jumping off of bridges. That would be slippery slope. It's saying that the principle that you've given me also justifies this other thing. It's rather the rationale the child is using would sort of entail that that child should be allowed to jump off of a bridge, but that's absurd. But that's ludicrous. We've satisfied our 3 conditions. We've got a pretty good reductio here. These analogical arguments, the main thing I was looking for is that you were sort of just describing them or discussing them in the correct way. People did a really good job with this first one on the whole. My analogs are A and B. These 2 ambiguous, spherical, yellow, and hard objects. We know A is tasty. So B is tasty. That's the sort of proposal that's being made here. And almost everyone, quite reasonably, I think, said we need more information. There's lots of things that are spherical, yellow, and hard that are not tasty. It's a simple fact that we have spherical, yellow, and hard just isn't enough. Like, for example, a golf ball. A golf ball has all 3 of those properties. It's certainly not spherical, round, and hard. A lot of you sort of made really good suggestions. Maybe like you'd want to know where these objects were found. If both objects were found in the same bag of candy, then yeah, that's probably pretty reasonable. On the other hand, if both objects were found randomly on the floor, maybe not so reasonable. Right? So things like that were sort of what I was looking for. And again, people did pretty well with that second question. People did pretty well with this one as well. So here, what are my analogs? The past war and this sort of future feared war. Right. And one is the past war was bad, so the future war will be bad. I'd say this is a pretty good analogy overall. And the reason why in this case, and again, people did pretty well in this question too, the reason why I would say this is a pretty good analogy overall is this specific thing that's been put in, even though we won the last war. So even though the last war ended really well, it was still awful. It was still a disaster for our country in various sorts of ways. And so you don't sort of need to know how likely is the nation to win. They're not relevant in this case because the analogy doesn't depend upon those. They won the first war and it was still awful. A couple things people brought up I really liked in this question. A lot of people said, it doesn't seem like war is the sort of thing that we should expect to change really dramatically. That was another thing. Why to think that the similarities were more relevant than the dissimilarities? And yeah, some people brought this point up, and I thought this was a perfectly good point. All right, causal arguments. Almost everyone correctly identified that 4 is the best available explanation. Almost everyone got that part right. So you got 3 points just for sort of correctly identifying that. Then next thing you needed to do is almost go through the chain of reasoning as to how you got there, how you sort of crossed off all these. And the more precisely you put your answer in terms of the sort of causal criteria, the higher your score was in terms of this answer. So we could get rid of number 2. Because it happened after the effect, right? Cy started working for the community college after he quit the campaign, not before. Causes have to be before their effects, right? We can reject number 5 because it's not a credible cause. It doesn't fit into our established causal frameworks. Right. And this was the 3rd criteria. Right. Number 1 can be rejected because it doesn't fit the data as well. If you're scared of public speaking, you wouldn't have presumably ran for election in the first place, plus you wouldn't have started working at a community college. Both of those involve public speaking. That's our 4th criteria. And lastly, number 3 can be rejected because of Occam's razor. Right. It's important to note 5, you shouldn't have gotten rid of 5 because of the astrological signs. You shouldn't have gotten rid of that because of Occam's razor. That should have got rid of even before you got there, right? That's not the right kind of cause, so it's not even really a candidate to see how well it fits the data or fails to fit the data. People did a pretty good job With the second causal problem, the big thing I was looking for is how well you sort of explained Occam's razor. So the one of these that violates Occam's razor is A. Yeah, I told you just assume both fit the data equally well. So assume both of these are equally sort of good candidates in that regard. But it's far more, now some people put this in terms of likelihood, and that wasn't exactly the right way to put it. You need far more steps or far more assumptions to explain how you get a zebra to Colorado than you do how you get a horse to Colorado. And so as a result, the explanation is more complicated, right? Less simple. And so that was the main thing I was sort of looking for. I was looking for that in some sense. The zebra explanation is getting more complicated, not necessarily more likely. That's sort of a different question. Occam's razor is specifically about the simplicity of the explanation. All right. So this one surprised me. You all are far too trusting in a lot of cases. A lot of you wanted to say this doesn't violate the improper appeal to authority. This argument egregiously is an improper appeal to authority. Why? All right. So one concern, and I agreed with a lot of people who said this. One concern, this person can't give sort of an explanation of why what they're saying is true, but we can indeed not be too worried about that. But a lot of you said this, and I think you're right. This is excusable in this case because we do have this judge's gag order. So understandable, right? This person is sort of legally prohibited in a sense from sort of presenting as the sort of story in the right way. That part's fine. The part that's not fine is the conflict of interests. This person is literally being paid to say, oh yeah, my client is totally innocent. And indeed, they would say it even if their client was not innocent. In fact, they'd be professionally obligated to say it. This is this person's client, right? They are being paid to say this person is innocent. We therefore cannot just take their word for it. Regardless of their other qualifications. And indeed, they might well be highly qualified. Perhaps if they were speaking about a case that they weren't directly involved in, we should take their testimony seriously. But a case where they are literally being paid to say what they're going to say, and they would say it even if they didn't believe it, that's not a case where we can just take their word for it on the subject matter, right? To say that this argument doesn't commit the improper appeal to authority is to just say that if you are on the jury, oh, well, the defense attorney says the guy's innocent, so I guess he's innocent. That's not an appropriate arena where this sort of appeal to authority can just belong. People did a bit better with the second one. The second one's a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more up in the air. There's a couple various sorts of concerns I was thinking for. On the whole, this one's probably okay. It's not overwhelmingly strong. Some of you argue that the teacher might have a conflict of interest. The sister might have some sort of conflict of interest. I guess I've never thought of elementary schools as having like much incentive to try to get people into their school, but maybe you're right. I mean, there could perhaps be a conflict of interest here. I certainly didn't take points away if you made this suggestion. Perhaps a more serious one, a couple of you brought this up, I thought this one was right. Perhaps more serious, it's not clear that being a teacher makes you an expert in school administration. Or at the very least, that you'd be the most qualified expert. She's not an administrator. She presumably didn't go to school in school administration, right? And this was the third criteria. This was our third. So I'd say this is probably the most worrying thing. But even still, that would probably be a reason to not, maybe trust her all the way. But indeed, particularly if all the other teachers agree with her. Her testimony is at least valuable. So we're probably going to at least maybe be a little bit more skeptical, but not reject the testimony altogether. And at the very least, if this is all you knew about the school, you probably would be rational to find a different school for your child. All right. Statistical syllogisms. People did pretty well here. So we have the overwhelming majority of people who survived early childhood going to be at least 35 years old. Sammy has survived to her teenage years, well past early childhood, despite years of heavy drug abuse. We've got fallacy of incomplete evidence. Right? The relevant statistics is people who survive early childhood who are heavy drug abusers. In the case of number 2, we got very likely. The conclusion is indeed very likely to be true. If we assume that this is correct, that it is indeed incredibly rare that the cause of a person's death is a car crash, then yeah, you, just some random person, are not going to be the exception to the rule. Right? We have no reason to think that the most rational thing to believe would be that, you're right. And again, you said this over an incredibly rare, that sounds like more than 75% to me. So I'm going with very likely here. This one was a little bit trickier, but actually you all did pretty well with it on the whole. I was pleased with your answers to this one. I'm gonna say this one is somewhat likely to be true. Okay. There is this little piece of data that Darius is left-handed. But the fact that Darius is left-handed doesn't really seem to be relevant to a person's lifespan. You didn't need to say this, by the way. This is just me adding in a little bit. All you needed to just say was somewhat likely to be true. But the fact that Darius is left-handed, being left-handed, it doesn't really seem like the sort of thing that we'd expect to matter, right? Whereas if it was Darius is a drug-using American male citizen, right? Then that's a problem, right? Then that would cause us to be concerned because we would expect drug users to live less than a sort of period of time on average than non-drug users. But being left or right versus right-handed doesn't seem as if it has any obvious connection to a person's lifespan. Now, someone actually mentioned that they had seen a study. They thought it was outdated, but they had seen a study that suggested that actually people with left hands might actually have a slightly shorter lifespan because of concerns about sort of like machinery usage and whatnot. And if that study actually was correct, then I suppose this would be committing the fallacy. But at least based on sort of how we normally think about it, at least, it doesn't really seem like being left-handed has much of anything to do with how long you're going to live. Or that left-handed people don't seem to live less long lifespans than right-handed people. All right. The inductive generalization, there's basically one key part. So sample group is the 30 watched movies. Right? The population, I watched horror movies in particular, sorry, watched horror movies. The population, all horror movies. People do well with that. Sampling method, some people call this stratified randomness. I gave it to you. That's not exactly right. They were trying to select at least a diversity of things, but it wasn't random. At least no randomness is actually mentioned. So there is sort of individual selection taking place. But this individual selection is still taking place on the basis of trying to sort of match various kinds of demographic informations. For example, critically acclaimed versus non-critically acclaimed. So technically not stratified randomness. So I saw where you were going if you said that. And you didn't lose points for suggesting that it was stratified randomness. It's just, there's not quite randomness. Like Ella's picking the movies that she's gonna watch. But there is a pretty serious problem here. Despite what is otherwise pretty good sampling methods, this is indeed committing the fallacy of biased statistics. Right? Why? Because she's only watching movies about ghosts and haunted houses. And there's lots of horror movies that don't involve ghosts or haunted houses. Right? There are serial killer movies. There are alien attack movies. There are horror comedies. Right? There's various things just besides ghost and haunted house movies. Right? And so you can't conclude about all horror movies just on the basis of talking about ghosts and haunted house movies. Some people said that this committed the hasty generalization, but I don't think I agree with you. I mean, I'm guessing there's probably genres of film you all don't like. I'm guessing you didn't watch 30 different movies in that genre to come to that conclusion. So I didn't think hasty generalization worked in this case, but we definitely do have fallacy of biased statistics, right? There's other genres of horror besides these. All right, go through these last ones pretty quickly. So we got, here we have a pretty clear instances of groupthink. I think that's at least the most obvious, right? B changes their more nuanced position into a more radical position as a result of sort of conforming to the group dynamics. Some people have some other things. It's not exactly clear to me what the ideological fixity was. At the very least, if you're going to ever say ideological fixity, you have to say what the ideology is. Similarly, I wasn't exactly seeing like my side exactly. Like this person does bring up indeed some of the environmental impacts, so they're not completely ignorant about them. Similarly with confirmation bias, we're not really evaluating evidence that much in this case, and confirmation bias is predominantly going to occur in the context of evaluating evidence. So I think groupthink is pretty clearly at least the best. I think maybe one person made a reasonably compelling argument for why it was confirmation bias, but on the whole, at least most people didn't explain it well enough to persuade me, at least, of the point. Groupthink was at least the one that I thought was pretty obvious in this case. Here, there were a few more answers that I thought were sort of reasonable. The one that so I'm fully committed to the view that dark energy does not exist and that it is not needed to explain the rate of universal inflation that we discovered. I recently read an article that suggested it might be possible to explain universal inflation in some different way. The one that seemed most obvious to me here is overconfidence. Because the article suggests that it might be possible. That's not enough to be fully committed. So a little bit more confident in the conclusion than the evidence actually suggested. Some people suggested need to be right, which was reasonable, I think. Right, and also confirmation bias. Right, and both of those, at least depending on how you explain them anyway, people at least explained how they thought these two are operative here in ways that I thought were pretty reasonable. Again, for ideological fixity, you need an actual ideology. So you would have to have sort of explained what the ideology was in this case. Again, I don't really see an ideology here. I do indeed see someone, though, who needs to be right, who's got a theory that they're sort of committed to. So you were able to sort of talk me into this one. I was less convinced about confirmation bias. But again, at least a couple people put it compellingly enough that I sort of went along with it. All right. So we had our last two questions, the two sort of hardest ones. People did reasonably well. So here, we've got an ad hominem, a particularly abusive ad hominem, as our fallacy. We're saying, I'm not going to listen to what you have to say, right, because of what the moral sort of status of the person is, right? The author must be evil and cruel, so I'm not going to listen to what the author's actual argument is. Related to this seems to be, in this case, pretty clearly the my side bias, right? The person just doesn't seem to be aware of what arguments on the other side of the abortion debate are. And as a result of this, they just assume that the only reason a person might well advance that view is just being evil and cruel. The thing I was sort of hoping you'd see is the way in which, in this case, these two, the fallacy and the bias sort of go hand in hand. They sort of are mutually strengthening each other in various sorts of ways. Some people have put this in terms of identifying with a belief. That's fine, I guess. I gave you at least some credit with that. This doesn't, I mean, at least they're not putting it that way. Whereas in this case, we're going to have a really, in the case of the second one, we're very clearly going to have sort of identified with the belief. They're at least just putting this at least argumentatively anyway. That's at least the way that we're getting it put. Not being aware of the argument seems to be a better way of characterizing it at least. And then, so then what would be a way perhaps of trying to overcome this sort of combo of the ad hominem plus the my side bias? I gave pretty much just whatever you wrote here. I gave you credit for it, but something to the extent perhaps of maybe we could at least try to see if there is anything to the argument, right? Maybe there are arguments that you're not aware of. We could at least look at those arguments before deciding to reject the view altogether. Something like this again. I mean, I wasn't looking for anything necessarily in particular, just some sort of productive kind of response. And then in this case of the second one, again, people mostly did a pretty good job identifying the fallacies, I thought. Here we have sort of the absence of evidence fallacy. Here, there's sort of, I've shifted the burden of proof. Away from me justifying, my belief or the author's belief. to demanding other people, to people who are sort of opposed to it. And so with this, what's in this case, it seems like this is pretty clearly coming from some sort of identification with the belief. Here, I think this one works a lot better than it did in the previous case because, yeah, I mean, I've been a devout believer for more than 30 years, right? I mean, that's sort of suggesting that's probably a pretty big part of how this person sort of sees themselves. You maybe could have said inside the box thing. I don't think anyone did, or at least they didn't argue for it very well. Maybe inside the box thinking that it's not just sort of this author's personal identification, but also kind of a social identification, like the group that the author belongs to. That could have been fine. And then again, what sort of response would I be looking for? Again, well, if we want to investigate the question, at least we've got to try to give reasons for again, both for and against the things that we believe. And so you should at least try to come up with some sort of justification, maybe, of your beliefs. Rather than just saying that other people's beliefs aren't adequate. So, yeah, and something like this. There's nothing in particular that I was looking for, but something of that general sort. All right, so that's gonna do it for the class. Basically, this is basically the last thing. So I hope that was helpful. I hope that was interesting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to send me an email or whatever, and I'll be happy to go over anything. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Thank you very much for all the good hard work you put in this semester. And I hope to, if you're graduating, good luck. And if not, I hope to see you in the future. Thank you very much.